Welcome, Adrian, to this conversation about co-creating the third attractor.
Thank you, Daniela, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you. And it's the 26th conversation. So we are adding puzzle pieces to the big picture here. And I always start with one question. Are you familiar with the term the third attractor?
Yes.
And if yes, can you give your small short explanation how you understand the third attractor and what it means to you?
Yes, I'm familiar with Schmachtenberg's writing and
Yeah.
his line of work, of course. And I think for me, the third attractor, also when thinking and feeling into it before this conversation, I would make it very brief and short. I would say it's stepping out of the binaries that bind us almost in the hypnosis of modernity.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's very beautifully put. And I had a recognition only recently that it's also interesting to see that the first and the second attractor, the chaos and the authoritarianism or the binaries, are in ourselves. We can find them in ourselves. And when you're stepping out of that, it really means also an inside process of stepping out of that attraction of these different of these not so healthy attractors, no?
Yeah, I would start, and of course we could have a nice conversation, but I would start to challenge already that
Yeah,
because
do it.
because I'm coming more from I mean I'm a recovering integralist. Let's say it like this.
Yeah,
So I was in love with Wilbur, I was in love with integral theory, and I think it gave me a lot of direction in my early 20s. I spent
yeah.
time in India, like I did a lot of that inner work. And what I'm just like 3, 4 years, since 3, 4 years, like with all the change and all the things that I'm always were interested in, how do you do inner development and outer change? I'm slowly starting to realize that there is something where, like the problem is not that we are not embodied. The problem is that we embody the wrong ontologies and epistemologies.
Hmm.
And that led me to like fascinating work of Dalanda, Deleuze, and Foucault, like the assemblage structure we live in. So the assemblage is something that is where relationality and interactions
Yeah.
form a construct, so to say, but it's more than a construct. It's not just a system. It's much more fluid in a way, but it binds you and it holds you in a certain ontology or a certain epistemology. And
Hmm.
what I'm realizing, especially also with reading a lot of complexity science, applied complexity science,
Hmm.
Dave Snowden's work, but also new materialism with Andy Clark, I'm fascinatingly and paradoxically start sometimes to get a glimpse of the non-dual nature of those schools of thought and how I think we are even now just on the edge of realizing how deep and how embedded we are, I would say in an Anglo-Saxon worldview, right? Where the individualism and where the Cartesianism is still built in. And also, unfortunately, in a lot of our spiritual thinking and sense making, right? So if I'm talking about inner, the
Hmm.
question is what is inner and what is outer. So
Yeah, yeah.
if I'm fundamentally entangled, and there's good research, especially when it comes to cognition, how it is enacted, um, and also enmeshed and entangled already in the context I'm sitting in.
Hmm.
So fundamentally, there is no inner and outer.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, there is something that moves and moves me within the context. Yeah. And then of course we could, you could go to interpersonal neurobiology, how your nervous system and everything is already built and comes from a certain culture or a certain family. And of course there are things I think where we can free us and ourselves. But the real interesting thing for me those days is that so often we don't ask the question, how is the water? And we just keep swimming as fish without even realizing.
Mhm.
So, a long story short, I think there is something, and I'm still trying to see and to feel into that, how to develop language and
Yeah.
capacity to not fall into the path dependency of that assemblage structure that is so tight. And we see it all over the world, how it has the grip and how we are, like compared to 10 years, I think we're moving in quite dangerous directions, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very true. And I mean, I resonate a lot with what you're saying. And with my spiritual heart, also coming from the Andrew
Mhm.
teaching, it in the end, it's all about embracing us, who we are as a non-dual process moving forward. Like when we make it really big and come from a oneness or non-dual perspective, then it's in the end us co-creating and not something creating something. No, it's like when you really let it in that it's possible that there is only one thing happening, and we are becoming more and more conscious, and we are co-creating, we are leaning into this mesh that moves forward towards whatever, towards the next moment.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's where for me, and this is an open question, and that's where I like also Bioaccumulators work, like where is the crack? Because the idea that it's us from a linguistic perspective already breaks that we are moving in that. I think there is so much agency built into the
Hmm.
interactions and built or not even built, but it's kind of like something where what if we constantly actually shifting more towards something where we believe we do something, right? Rather than relaxing to the constraint or also that kind of like blocks us from realizing that it's just moving, right? So there is something I think where agency has a place, but where agencies are much, much more important. And that where agency is so deeply entangled with materiality and consciousness already there, if you talk about it, we're separating it. And this is for me like an ongoing process and an ongoing inquiry.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
how do we find a language? And on one side, be very precise. So I'm a scientist. I research collective trauma, right? So how do you research something that is not an unknown, that is
Yeah.
not like something we don't know, that it's unknown, and that we actually don't want to know, right? So that brought me more or less also, of course, because I have this constraint of a certain scientific direction where I realized, like especially and I love this, I think I read it also on your website, where if you deal with these kind of complexities and complex
Hmm.
problems, right? There's something where by definition we will never find an answer
Yeah.
and we will always maybe be able to take the next right step, right? And we can
Yeah.
generate and build cultures, I think, that are capable of doing the next right step in a complex environment, and also
Yes.
seeing what is actually complex and what is complicated, right? If I do my laundry, like I don't need to have a PhD in complexity science. I just need to do it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so there is something where I feel like practice has an absolute place, right? Personal practice has, and especially in the traditions, like if taken serious, and then actually it doesn't matter if it's Western or Eastern,
Hmm.
there are ecologies of practices that are
Hmm.
quite deep and that are quite profound, and that I think to some extent we probably also have lost some of that rigor, um, especially in the West. And at the same time, there is a depth of scientific rigor that also comes in, where we only now slowly starting to understand some of the fundamental physics and biologies and complexities, right? So
Yeah.
this is also something where I feel um, a third attractor for me needs to, like needs to understand the ecology of practices, but also the ontological grounding, the epistemological
Hmm.
practice, as well as the
Hmm.
phenomenological perception. And we
Hmm.
probably also never will be in a state where those three are just in harmony, like because that's not
Yeah, yeah,
life, right? Like that's or like Dave Snowden once mentioned that they need to bump into each other because we
yeah.
know by now from neural science that our brains function through anomalies. We activate cognitively if something new happens.
Hmm.
But there's
Hmm.
also a lot of prediction actually happening in our system. Like
Hmm.
a vast part of cognition is actually not in our mind how we viewed it before, but it's actually built in the body, but also in the surrounding, actually, or in the computer that it's mediated through. It becomes
Yeah, yeah.
hard. Like cognition today is not something that rests only in my body. Based on new rigorous science like Andy Clark. And I find it super
Mm.
fascinating because there's, at least in the circles I'm often around, like there's still so much where it's so easy to slip into metaphysics.
Yeah,
It's so easy to slip into an inner outer binary
yeah.
where to some extent, or an individual and a collective, right? So I'm researching collective trauma. And to some extent, I still think we need to use those words because we don't have yet a different language, and they do have their probably be like I'm still using them. But I'm more and more becoming aware how tricky it is to then fall into what we actually want to change, and we tell a total different story. But the sense making structure and from the place where we come from, we're not gonna generate anything else
Yeah,
because we're holding on to the ontological grounding and the epistemological rigor um, that got us into trouble in the first place.
yeah, yeah. Whereas I hear you say, whereas what is actually happening is one much more fluid, much more dynamic, and has much more to do with the in-between spaces also and the relationships than with
Exactly.
the objects itself, no?
Exactly.
And that
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, it reminds me of Gregory Bateson's work also, like
Yeah.
he was very much focused on the in-between, no?
Yeah.
That is more important than the objects themselves.
Yeah. And I think there is a certain, for example, one thing is like you need to see the bigger picture or an holism, right? Like
Yeah.
so like we need to see like we need to have an holistic approach. So the problem often is like it's not going to lead to change in complex adaptive systems because you need to find the right level of granularity. So from complexity science where I'm coming from, there is a possibility where if you have the right level of granularity, you change the interactions, you
Hmm.
deterritorialize the assemblage structure, or
Hmm.
you could call it system, but I like assemblage structure more. So you deterritorialize it through the right level of granularity. And
Yeah.
you do that on mass, on scale, that's where change happens. But by
Yeah.
definition, you cannot, if you view it holistically, it's a handful of people and you build in the power structure itself again. So
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
is something where in my work, I'm asking myself, like, how do we build structures that support a sense making and a meaning making process that helps us to navigate complexity? And
Yeah.
it's not through like system maps or diagrams because they give us a false sense of security. They don't let us stay with the ambiguity and the process of not knowing, right? And
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
often are used as a power tool again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're also saying it's more about whatever we come up with that could help to change something. It's more about the process or the how we approach the complexity than to try to create an other system that we think would bring salvation. No? It's us learning to move in this complex and complexifying world in a different way. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
very nicely put. And I think this is of course also where personal practice can help. You know, like
yeah,
where if you have a capacity to meditate, you have a capacity probably to also hold more ambiguity.
yeah.
Ideally, if you know, like and there are very different schools and practices around. I think fundamentally they are not going to bring change as well. Like I think that's not enough. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
and while there might be an important part, and I think there is often also like there were sanctuaries, like throughout history that also preserved and influenced and helped to build culture. And at the same time, I think we, especially in a global culture, we are staying at the place where actually, and this is actually something that makes me hopeful, not optimistic, but hopeful, that we do understand a lot of principles from nature where
Hmm.
we can design systems that function much, much better than the classic modern sense-making processes that we are in right now, where I think there's a lot of power struggle, there's a lot of retrospective sense-making, right? So you'd connect a few
Yeah, yeah,
dots backwards and you say, look, this is what it is. It's,
yeah,
like that's not how it works. It's a story that you tell yourself. So I think,
yeah,
and the stories that we tell ourselves, especially the small ones, the micro narratives, they matter. Yeah.
yeah.
So, and just to have like one,
What
yeah.
about big stories? I would love to hear if you, because I have asked that quite a few people, and there is not agreement if we need new big
Mhm.
stories or not for the change that needs to happen. I'm very curious how you see that.
Very good one. Very good one. I would say one, the big story is always already a story that is emerging from the millions of micro narratives that are going on right now. So
Mm.
so
Hmm.
so of course you can have your own big story for the world and you can go and you can market it and you can share it, but honestly you're already functioning in a modernistic paradigm. Or maybe even
Mm.
or maybe even in a very traditional, like I have the book and everybody should follow
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
that's
exactly.
where the problem starts, right? So of course those days we make it more civilized and we invite people to conferences and there is something where this can generate energy. And I'm not, I'm personally not against it in that way, but
Hmm.
I don't think it leads to something
Yeah.
because fundamentally, like I would say like we're living in a narrative landscape, right? So there are a lot of stories, and from those stories, there's narrative patterns that are emerging. Right
Hmm.
now, what we see, like there are narratives patterns emerging across Europe, across the United States that are moving more or less, like in a direction that is quite scary, right? There's a
Yeah,
certain element of fascism, there's a certain element of tech feudalism, there's
yeah.
certain elements, yeah, maybe also conservatism. So, but it's not that, like to some extent, I think it it comes from interactions on the ground, and you can see and build and support that to come somewhere, right? But I think it's still something that is not, like it's not something where we can go out and say this is it, what we need to believe in. This is what we need. I think
No, but
the more important is, like to see on the right level of granularity. That means like in communities and maybe even in states, to see like what are the stories we want to have more of and what are the stories we want to have less of. But stories that lead directly towards action in an area where you embed it.
yeah,
Like so for me, that's the Black Forest, that's Freiburg, that's my hometown. Maybe Germany. Like how do we come together to say like, okay, this is happening, this is what we want more of, this is what we want to have less of. So
yeah,
I'm much more interested in micro narratives, like the stories we share each other over a cup of tea.
yeah.
Or for example, that was not recorded, but we know each other since a while, so we share stories about
Hmm.
people that we know that we haven't known or thought, or there's information exchange. And I think
Yeah, yeah.
if we can track these kind of narrative landscapes, then we get patterns, right? We get similarities, we get
Hmm.
tensions, and that is something we can navigate. Like that is something where I feel like what we, for example, do with complexity partners, with Annie Kaspari, with the sense maker, with Dave Snowden, what if we not boil it down, like to a vision we all agree to, but we collect all the change moments that are there, and then we position it, or people position their stories themselves. Epistemic
Yeah,
justice,
yeah,
very important. It's not me who interprets that story for them. They position it, like, is it from the past, from the present, and from the future? And suddenly I see patterns emerging. The past
yeah,
stories,
yeah,
they still relate around 1933, maybe. Yeah. The future stories, okay, there's a lot around climate change and climate fear. And the present stories, okay, there's a lot going on right now around hardship and economic despair. So
yeah,
and then I can say, like, okay, from here, how do we then move into small actions, but on scale, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
if you look, yeah, sorry, I maybe I stop
Uh, uh,
here and let
No,
you
no,
continue.
I totally agree, and it's very interesting when I listen to you. This is kind of what I try to do with my third attractor conversations. It's very similar because
Mhm.
I have talked now to 25 very different people with their narratives. They're smaller, bigger, but often small narratives, their view of how to change the world, how to take a step into a better future. And it feels exactly like what you described, that when I look into the collective of these conversations now, I do see patterns. I do see things coming up again and again. I do see things where I feel like, oh, that's an interesting thread where I would like to know more. Like one is, for example, this always upcoming question of, is change coming bottom up or top down? Like this is just such a pattern, and I can already hear you say that's again the old materialistic way of looking. But at the same time, I want to challenge that also, because I feel like, what is it? What is it then that will change the big picture in the end? Like looking 200 years in the future, will it all have come up from small initiatives? Or will at one point something crystallize that could actually come top down and help the transition? I don't know. I don't have the answer. I just find it a very fascinating question.
Yeah, and it is, and I think it's also not something to answer lightly, but like,
No.
I think for me, there's a beautiful story coming from biology, from honeybees. And probably you know that one. It's the waggle dance. So what happens when bees, like when they need to find a new home, and
Hmm.
this is actually to some extent, like the situation we are in as a human species, right? I mean, we to some extent, like we need to deal with our home. I mean, we probably shouldn't go to Mars.
Hmm.
I mean, at least that's my
Yeah.
opinion. But so what do bees do? Like, it's a very delicate moment, right? Because if you don't
Hmm.
find the right place, you die. So
Hmm.
scientifically speaking, there's a lot of good research on this, very rigorous research. They always find the best possible place that they can reach.
Hmm.
Much better than we making decisions often, right? About our future.
Mm.
And how do they do it? So there is something very, very interesting that, like they scout and they communicate it back.
Yeah.
Are able to actually sense, like the direction based on the sun and the flight patterns. And what happens is it's a non-intelligent distributed mechanism, because the more bees that check the place out and the more happy they are about it, the more they start dancing. And this is a process that usually goes over quite some time. There are even bees that interfere with the process so that so that it's not settling too quick, so that all the options
Hmm.
are actually explored, right?
Hmm.
And it's a process that invites a form of distributed collective intelligence that I think, of course, we are not bees, right? So we not communicate through dance. I mean, sometimes we do. I love to dance. Um, but for us, this is like signals, right? Like, how do we
Hmm.
collect the signals to then come to collective decision making. And this means that not one person has all the information available. That's a
Yeah.
very important principle, I think, because if one person claims to have everything, we already not in a complex system are. And most, by definitions, the problem, like we're talking about with the third attractor, are all complex problems. So
Yeah.
you never have an overview, right? And this is, of course, we can think about what happens in 200 years. I actually get hopeful. Like I feel like in 150 years, the sun might come out. Like on the long term, I'm quite hopeful. I'm very pessimistic on the short term where we're
Hmm.
standing right now. Um,
Hmm.
but going back to that, like there's so many variables that could change history. One story that really stuck with me, like Dave Snowden was sharing that once, was that like the emperor of China almost became Catholic. And it was actually the Pope who then intervened because the Jesuits, they were kind of like managing that, and it was almost there. So you could
Yeah.
see just retrospectively, like it would have changed the whole history of humankind.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So there is an element where I think, yes, there is divine intervention. Yeah.
Hmm.
Right. So there is like giving up hope is a mortal sin. So there is the moment of grace, but
Yeah.
it's not something that you can engineer. But what we can engineer is that we bring together people, that we organize and build structures where based like on the stories, on the narratives, on the lived experience that we share with each other, see patterns, and then start to make sense out of it. And
Yeah.
of course, in a society, I would say, of course, there are different levels of influence where like if you're working in a national department, it's different, right? But then at the same time, for example, what we started to do as an initiative was, for example, Eurosense, like World Europe. It's a pan-European movement. It's a party, which is also a movement, like, and they really want to build Europe, like, and have a structure where they say, look, we want to be one European party. We not want to
Yeah.
mingle only in the States. So they're kind of like this movement. And what they said is, how can we build like a citizen sensor network, right? Where, and now just imagine you collect on the ground through schools every week the local stories, like what do you experience as a citizen right now?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then like people signify they position themselves in systemic tensions, right? It's not
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
Likert scales, like how well do you feel, like 1 to 10, how enlightened are you, 1 to 10,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
it's that's in my opinion, it's a bit of a joke, but there is something. If you ask a question, does your story relate more to tradition or innovation? What is more important to
Hmm.
you, right?
Hmm.
So through that, you see you see the evolutionary potential in the present moment.
Yeah.
You can make that accessible. And of course, if you have that kind of information, I want to have the European Parliament, and we already worked on that, right? Like we didn't gather so many stories. It's a small initiative. But the idea is, like, well, Europe already has people sitting in the EU Parliament, so they can dive into the direct experience and see the patterns of the experience. So it's not that you
Yeah.
first need to read the thousands of stories.
Hmm.
You can see, wow, there is actually all over Europe from those 5 million stories that we have collected, 4.5 million are really, they really want innovation. And half the
Hmm.
million that is really into tradition, it's not about tradition. It's actually about health insurance or whatever, right? And
Hmm.
these are the kind of patterns, I think, and that's the kind of structures where I see like we are capable of building it. We're not doing it yet. And I think there's a certain nitty-gritty work that also doesn't sell well because it's
Yeah.
always nice if you can sell a good story, right?
Hmm.
Um, but so this is more a direction of change where I would say, and again in an assemblage structure, like you don't have those neat circles of micro, meso, macro. Like there are direct links, and of course there are centers of power and gravities of power. But to be honest, like a good friend of mine once told me, and they met. Um, they met with very high officials in oil and climate, and they said like, look, we need people to go on the streets, so we have the pressure to do something, right? So even
Yeah.
even in certain positions where you feel like they have a lot of power top down, they build into an assemblage. It's not about, it's not that you can have a lot of power. I think there's a lot of illusion how much people can actually do. And you see that
Yeah.
also with people like Trump, right? So what is the underlying structure, and that is the danger, is of course that a lot of people got together to moving a more conservative and I would also say quite right-wing agenda forward, that understood how to tell those little stories and how to connect those dots. Yeah. For example, with Thiel and others. So there is something where they understood the meta politics, right, of how to influence culture. And
But isn't that exactly that's
yeah,
exactly, in my opinion, how the first and the second attractor got so powerful in a way, because the story of the benign dictator, or the dictator that knows where to go and what to do, and that people can trust this guy is strong and therefore he will lead the way, like as happened
yeah.
or seems to have happened with Trump. That is a big story, and not only a micro story, it's a macro story that where people buy into or have bought into, no?
Yeah, and I would
Uh,
say like, but that's what grew out of it, right? Like I think that is the tree that we see.
yeah,
But really interesting is the substrate. Like, what was the substrate that that story could grow off? Like, what is the field that where that seed planted was able to grow,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that is something interesting, I think, where you suddenly come like suddenly the story is not that famous anymore or that big, but you realize, okay, there were a lot of white people in the Obama era that really got, like that really kind of like felt not taken care of. There's a certain MAGA movement that is really confused with the complexity of the world and the sense-making process that is corrupted then through social media, not through a narrative, but through a very addictive
mm,
perspective and a very extractive logic of social media, like where
hmm,
the sense making was corrupted. So conspiracy theories are great. They're really great for our cognition because what they give us is a certainty. It's retrospective sense making, right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
of course, fascism or the need for a strong leader always comes down to that fear, that ambiguity, and that not knowing, where you realize somebody will take care of me, right? Somebody
Yeah,
will solve it. So there
yeah,
is, and that is something I think it only takes hold as a global narrative if the ground is fertile, right? And I
yeah,
think this is what has happened in the States, unfortunately. And then, of course, you have actors that exploit or that build and get involved, like with politics and with money.
yeah,
But I think there's also a chance where if we get, like if we get the principles right to design different systems where we don't need to engage in a lot of ideological warfare or in, like 10, 20 years of healing, but where we can find actually what, even if you're a diehard Republican and I'm a Democrat or vice versa, where we find a third attractor, right? Like
yeah,
if
yeah, yeah.
you in a
That's
community, like it's
yeah,
very hard to hate somebody as a human. I think
yeah,
like neurologically, we are not built for hate. So if I have something that I share with you, even if it's just like reading the same books or liking the same authors and getting
yeah,
to know you on the right level of and this is something that happens on the right level of
hmm,
granularity, not in social media. And and
hmm.
and I think that's where, like, and it doesn't mean like, like it's just me talking to somebody. It means like we need a lot of people talking to somebody they usually don't talk. This is what we had in the past, you know.
So
Today,
my question is, how do we create that? Do you see pockets where this actually is happening? Like, not only in fringe small communities. Do you see initiatives where you feel like, if this is going to grow, if this is spreading, then I have hope that this can really change something? Because I can follow everything that you are
yeah,
saying. It makes a lot of sense. I just don't see it happen right now. I see exactly the opposite happening. More polarization, less less possibility to talk
mhm,
between the poles. People don't even want to talk when they have very different opinions about something. So it's this polarization that seems to make everything stagnate. It doesn't feel like there is a coming together.
Mhm. Yeah, it's of course it's nice that you mentioned pockets, right? Because I'm working for the Pocket Project. So I would say the Pocket Project probably still counts as something that is, like we're a small NGO, but still
Hmm.
globally we have a bit of a reach. So, like
Hmm.
we collected over 1,300 micro narratives with the international labs where there were over 30 groups that said like, look, we're gonna look at collective trauma, be it the Great Famine in Ireland and how that affected us, be it, German Jewish history, be it just like being Jewish or Afro-American, like really
Hmm.
people coming together with a commitment to look, feel, and dive into topics that we usually, like where we usually kind of like hold a lot of implicit memory and charge, energetic charge, right?
Yeah.
Trauma.
Yeah.
And it's humbling and it's beautiful to see what happens in 1 year with people that are just committed to one time a month meeting and going through the
Mm.
process together. And actually we published a sacred storybook on it, like where you can see and read how a different possibility of sense making happens. And of
Mm.
course this is still very small. So frankly speaking, I think we are not living in easy times. Like I'm not optimistic. And
Yeah.
I'm not optimistic for the next 20, 30, 40 years. But there's a lot of strange attractors that might change something very quickly or not. Like I'm also not giving up on that option.
Yeah.
Like, but I'm not preparing for that either. Like to say like, like there is a possibility that 12 million people die in 1 day with climate change. People, experts discuss those days much more when rather than if it's happening. Like
Hmm.
certain heat plus humidity, the water in the air, and you have 24 hours, right? And there are
Yeah. Yeah.
areas in China and India where a lot of people live in it. So
Hmm.
I think we're gonna see more crisis, and this is not coming from a doomsday perspective. Like again, when I'm looking at 150 years, we probably I have great hope and great trust in humanity, but the level of suffering I feel is gonna increase.
Yeah.
There's also kind of like a lot of what comes up in these movements and what we sense right now, I think is also something that is almost like a detox. Um, How many lives that will cost, I don't know, honestly. Like
Hmm.
I didn't
Hmm.
believe that the Ukraine war would start. It did start. And, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
still at the same time, I think there are a lot of small initiatives or bigger initiatives. There's a lot of good stuff going on always and always already has, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I think there's also some and then of course I think um what excites me is that we're moving into a direction where we more and more have the capacities and the capabilities. So is it here? I would say no, but can we already start? And are people starting? Yes, absolutely.
Hmm. Do you see a role for AI in all of this?
That's a good discussion to have, and a big one. I
Hmm.
think I think for me the important part is that what AI does and what AI is good in is calculation. It's a
Yeah.
calculation of
Analysis.
yeah, no, the analysis is built on probabilities, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of like it can, and I'm using AI every day, and it gives you great answers for certain things. But you shouldn't build AI into human sense making, where it's the
Yes.
AI that works on the complex problems. Because AI, I think, is really good in things that are simple or complicated. AI will help us a lot in many areas if we mediate it well, because it will give us the time then to really practice abduction, which means like to really connect dots that haven't been connected in a novel way. And there's also
Hmm.
something around, like AI is not intelligence. I refuse actually, I really like the definition of AI much more as machine learning because it gives us
I
a false
agree.
sense of intelligence. Intelligence is actually when I can smell you.
Yeah.
There's trust is actually also centered around pheromones. We know that by now in research. Um,
Hmm.
the way I embody dance, like AI will never do because it doesn't has a body. So there's a lot of implicit knowledge, and of course there's a strong a strong possibility to lose a lot of capabilities if we rely too much on AI. And at the same time, I think there's also a bit of a bubble um, where people will start to realize that there is actually a place for humans, and that there is actually something where, like, and of course I'm coming from the Black Forest, so Dasein, like the ground of being, and
Yeah,
like a good friend of us, Tom Steininger, who passed away this year, like I had great conversations with him around that, like so
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
so so the
It's a Heidegger term, no?
it's a Heidegger term, exactly. He was
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
an,
yeah, yeah,
quite well read in that. So, but there
yeah,
is something where Heidegger already saw that coming. With all the controversy, I'm aware of that, and the
yeah,
collective
yeah,
trauma that he carries. But there is something around being, and the forgetfulness of being that the technique brings in. He argued that it is a frame, the framing, right? Technique
yeah,
frames. So AI
yeah,
gives us already a frame that we are in, and the difficulty is that we're not getting into the messiness and the juiciness of the ontologies and epistemologies that we have when we really start to critically think and to really
yeah,
build, like to really co-create meaning and sense making together with the
yeah, yeah.
capacities as humans. And in that sense, AI challenges us also about this question: what is a human being, right?
Hmm.
And at the same time, there are fantastic things you can do with it, but I think it's still um there's still too much hype on it, like I think on another hand, like I can totally see how AI sensors could help us in climate change globally, right? Like
Hmm.
to gather real life data and to really kind of like extract in the domain of complicated a lot of good information. And at the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
time, where we're moving into complex problems, we need entro complexity. We need human beings to make sense out of it. AI doesn't understand language. I think a lot of people don't get that.
yeah,
AI,
yeah, yeah.
like it's numbers and it's math. And of course, there's a lot of like there's a lot of neuronormativity in the places where people build AI. I have a good friend who worked in Silicon Valley, like, and he said like he never ever saw that much disembodied people like there. Like
I can imagine that. Yeah,
he talked to
yeah,
people who said like I've never had a good experience with my body. So
yeah,
I'm not surprised that we get transhumanism,
yeah,
right? Where
yeah,
people
yeah.
want to upload themselves. But I think this is something, like where it's gonna be interesting. And I think I think there's no fear needed, but there's discernment needed.
Yeah. I totally agree. A lot of discernment. And I'm personally getting very concerned when I see people already now use AI as their therapist, as their consultant when they are desperate, when they have personal problems. And I've met people, and there I feel like, oof,
Yeah,
that's not going well. That's
yeah,
not going in a good direction.
yeah. Yeah, there is something that made me think, and I think it's from Tristan Harris. Like he said, like social media was really about capturing human attention.
Yeah,
But AI is the game to simulate intimacy.
yeah, yeah.
But you never get real intimacy, even if it feels like,
No,
right?
yeah. Yeah, and again, the in-between space is missing. There is no real in-between
Yeah.
space that we share in an intersubjective dialogue. Like the intersubjective is not there in a truly embodied and feeling sense.
Yeah.
And that will always be missing.
Yeah, I agree. And I
Yeah,
and I think it could, like it can augment and support a lot, probably. But I think and in an ideal world, of course, it also gives us more time to focus on the human sense making and get the boring stuff
hopefully.
done by our agents. But I'm also aware that's already what we said about the internet itself, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it didn't really turn out so
No,
well.
and and then of course I also don't want to be a cultural pessimistic. So I think I think there is a possibility still where we discern and where we play and where we build, um, yeah, and especially with all the knowledge that we have, like, and also with the practices.
Yeah.
I think there is something where I also want to acknowledge, like the capacities that we have those days, also because of technology, right? To get information
Hmm.
and to get knowledge and to
Yeah, yeah.
understand even this conversation that we're having right now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Find like-minded people, have
yeah,
conversations that are not
yeah,
blocked by geographical distance. That this is all very valuable.
yeah.
We just have to use our senses to use it wisely.
Yeah. And like just maybe also to come back to one point that you said, like there's so many people that don't talk to each other anymore. I think there's also a bit of a myth in, like in the subcultures we are around, that if you sit together and have real dialogue, you're going to solve things and it's going to move forward, right? And while I love that, and while I
Yeah.
have a high appreciation for, like all kinds of co-creative or evolutionary dialogue practice, I think, and this is actually something that really excites me. It's not always needed. Like there's an example from a peace building initiative in Ireland, where they brought like Protestants and Catholics.
Hmm.
Dave Snowden was involved in that as well, and he brought them actually to a slum in Brazil, and
Hmm.
they were basically not talking about the conflict at all, but they were
Hmm.
there to do good work for the people
Oh,
in the slum
yeah.
region. And the relationships that built there lasted until the Friday Agreement and supported the Friday Agreement. And they decided when they had the trust to talk to each other. So there is an emergent property, right? When
That's
I
amazing.
know this is a topic I can now talk to you because now
Yeah.
I know you, now we have a relationship. And I think
Yeah.
this is something where, like discovering pattern based on human data, right? I mean, you need the data from humans, their stories, and also their signification, where they position their
Hmm.
stories.
Hmm.
But then you might find patterns, and you might be even able to use AI to some extent for that, where
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
overlap in interest, and then you put them together in a different context, and you let them work on something. And I think
Yeah. Yeah.
this is something that, while we are not doing it yet, I think it's something that gives me hope, because I think this is something you can start, like fractally speaking, on all kinds of level. This is also
Hmm.
something how we could build different political structures or democratic structures, like where small scale experiments are much, much more important. You give people 5,000 euros if they get three people together, like the village priest, a young person and a woman, right? And if they say like, oh yeah, we want to have more stories of that, that's what we agreed in the village council, and we have an idea, they just try, right? I mean, those days it's quite interesting, like the World Bank can give you 50 million, and then for sure the project is going to be a success because nobody can afford to lose that money, right? So you have all kinds of people making meaning out of that, how that was a success, that project. But the World Bank cannot deliver 5,000 euros to persons, like on scale. So,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
those are the processes where I think people already starting to have these kind of conversations. And that is for me also kind of like almost the principle, like everybody all at once, right? Like where
Yeah.
we suddenly realize the potentials through the micro interactions on scale. And it doesn't mean that it's just grassroots. There is something where we can start to sense and see patterns more in a sense of evolutionary potential right now.
Yeah.
Right? We scan the narrative landscapes, we see the patterns, we might even support that with AI, but the sense making still lies with humans.
Yeah. Yeah. What I really love in what you're saying is that there is a limit to what we can talk about and think about and create with the mind, and there is so much more power in actually just coming together and live together, be together, take decisions together. I find it fascinating how challenging it is even in a small group to take decisions. No,
Yeah,
decision making processes are such an interesting topic because it's not always the intelligence of the masses, but sometimes it is. So how do we take decisions, even in a group of 20?
yeah,
What is the right approach
yeah,
to
yeah,
take decisions?
yeah. And already there we have fascinating research going on. Like, so for example, if you look at evolutionary biology, like we evolved to make decisions up to 6 people. If
Mm.
we are a larger group, we are not compromising anymore as much. So if you talk
Yeah.
about why it's difficult to have 20 people, it's because of our evolutionary
Oh,
imprint, right? Because we are
wow.
used to make decisions in small family structures, and
Yeah.
there we're willing to compromise. But the moment we grow bigger, there's more infighting going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is also something where, if you shift the level of granularity back to 5 or 6 people, and you have like maybe 4 groups that make different decisions, you might get easier answers, right? So, so,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, so and I'm not saying that's the answer to everything, but I think there's a lot that we learn also around, like what are actually the constraints, right? Like what are, like biologically speaking now, what are attractors?
Hmm.
And what are actors, and how can we bring them together, and how can we look at the next right possible step rather than the big perfect solution? I think this is,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and then and then you have something where, like where even things like rituals have a very powerful place, right? Like because, and these are things we can consciously design, like to shift identity and then come back, and as simple as if you walk into, like into a health clinic, like you take on a different coat, you shift your
Hmm.
identity, it's a ritual. And I think
Hmm.
I think these kind of little things, how we work with attractors like rituals, like that change something, how we are aware what kind of constraints are actually governing and helpful, what are constraints that we want to get rid of,
Hmm.
right? These kind, like to prepare the soil, to prepare the substrate, and to see. And I think this is a difficult one for me, definitely. Like I kind of like a Savior Anonymous, like we just founded the Savior Anonymous with friends, and it was actually a joke on a conference about is there a third way possible in Finland?
Yeah.
And we posted it, and now 130 people will show up to the meeting, or actually they registered. And like it was actually more of a joke where we said like, look, we are fed up with change making, and we are kind of,
Yeah.
but we can't stop. So there is something where it's very uncomfortable to be with the complexity, right? And not to have
Yeah.
like one big thing. And this is something I find very fascinating because, like, relax, nothing is under control. And it doesn't mean you're not doing something, but probably, like if we just keep doing better the things that don't work or that actually make things worse, like unintended consequence.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Doesn't work.
No.
Yeah. Wow. That was a lot. Great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Also for your openness and your questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was really delightful.